George Weigel, welcome to Facebook Live. Hey, folks, I'm Mark Brumley. I'm excited to be talking to George Weigel today about his new book, Not Forgotten. There's so much in this book, George. We could spend hours and hours. We don't have that. I have to read, though, the long subtitle, even though it's going to take longer than usual for subtitles, because it so expresses the essence of this book. The title of the book is Not Forgotten: Elegies for and Reminiscences of a Diverse Cast of Characters, most of them admirable, George. And having read the book twice now, I can say most of them are admirable, but not all. George, I'm going to do the thing that people that introduce people have to do. I'm going to tell people that you're the distinguished fellow, a senior fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center in DC, and you are the William E. Simon Chair in Catholic Studies. You've written loads of books, a couple dozen at this point, and you're a New York Times bestseller, a biographer of Pope St. John Paul II. In my view, a significant figure in the life and mission of the Church of the United States in its own right. That's all biographical stuff up front, we have to say, so that people understand you and put you in the proper context. But what I want to communicate to people about this book is you are a marvelous elegist. These are superb, very accessible elegies of some of the most notable people in our culture in the last 50 years. And in some cases, I think in many cases, going back even further than that. What is the thread that brings all these folks together?
Well, first of all, Mark, thanks very much to Ignatius Press for publishing this book. I had noticed a few years ago that I had been writing an awful lot of obituary columns or elegies in recent years. And it occurred to me that as I'd been fortunate enough to meet and work with an awful lot of consequential people in my life, that a collection of these and some that had been written earlier might be of real interest to my readers. The thread that binds them together, I think, is that each of these lives teaches us something about noble living, even though, to go back to that Victorian subtitle, some of them teach us lessons about noble living along the old via negativa, how not to do it. But I would thank you for the compliment about my elegiac skills. Let me compliment you on pronouncing reminiscences correctly. I've done about 30 interviews on this book, and you're the second interviewer to get the word reminiscences out correctly on the first try.
Well, I figure that if I'm going to hang around with you, even just for interviews, I have to try to get the words pronounced correctly.
Well, it was a fun book to do, and I've been most gratified in the last 2 months the book's been out, month and a half, and how many people say they found it encouraging. I'm not sure I wrote it with precisely that in mind. I wrote it to memorialize some important people and some interesting people, but this has been a tough year, and if people find some inspiration for the future, some sense of hope for the future in recollecting these consequential lives, then that's great. I'm very grateful that that's happened.
Well, this is going to be a challenge because there are so many wonderful people in here. Wonderful, at least to talk about. Some of them are not so wonderful in person, but wonderful at least to talk about. You've got folks who are sports figures, political figures, pop culture icons, educators, novelists, what else? Clergy, laity, significant Catholic figures, significant figures from other faith traditions, and things of that sort in here. And I'm not kidding. It's, as you know, I mean, it can be a challenge to write about someone, to write an elegy, and yet make it interesting, make it more than so-and-so lived from such and such a time and did great things. You've done a great job of telling us who these people are, but why we should care, and that's really a challenge. And so the challenge for the remaining of this time is going to be talking about as many of these folks as we can get in here, and recognizing the fact that we're not going to be able to cover everybody. So I want to start with right out of the gate here. I'm curious why you chose to lead off with Fadi Batra. Now, I'm trouble pronouncing his name. It's funny. I think I once watched an interview with him 10 years ago, and I thought if and the interviewer kind of struggled a little bit in pronouncing his name. I thought if I ever had to interview him, I would probably get his name wrong. I'm not interviewing him, but I'm interviewing you about him.
Fadi Batra's leadoff, simply for alphabetical reasons. We decided to organize the book alphabetically. But that's a deserved place in the lineup. Fadi Batra, who was a Lebanese Shiite who came to the United States as a young man, taught for many years here in Washington at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. One of the most civilized people I have ever met in my life. A profound scholar of the culture and politics of the Middle East. His book of what now must be 25 years ago, called The Arab Predicament,
right,
is, I still think, the best analysis of why the Middle East is so often a mess. And Fadi and I became friends. He invited me to speak to his seminar, particularly about the role of the Catholic Church in world affairs. We had a similar view of the post 9/11 politics of the Middle East and the American role in all of that. He died far too young. And like many of the people in this book, these 68 profiles, whom I met and worked with personally, I just miss him a great deal. So it's good to be able to remind people that there was a man of that quality, of mind and spirit in our time, thinking about some of the toughest problems in world politics and writing about them in a lilting, sibilant, beautiful prose style in what must have been his second or third language.
Mm-hmm. Well, Jami is an interesting fellow because, especially from an Islamic perspective, because he took a stance in relation to post 9/11 that was far and away not typical.
Yeah, no, that's right. I mean, Fadi knew that 9/11 grew out of what he frankly called the pathologies of the Arab Middle East. And he was unsparingly clear-minded in describing those pathologies and describing how distorted views of Islamic theology and law had led to not only terror regimes in Arab lands, but the export of that throughout the world. And he wanted something better for the people of the Middle East than that. And in that sense, his critique of the culture from which he emerged has to be seen in a positive light. This was a critique in aid of renewal and reform.
Again, resisting the temptation to go too far down this line because we've got a lot of things to cover here. It's interesting that he, I can see how the two of you sort of resonate because he is critical of the tradition out of which he comes, but he is critical out of that tradition, out of a love for that tradition. So he to use language that you often use, looking for resources within a tradition to critique that tradition in a way that brings the adherents of that tradition to a more reasoned practice and understanding of their own tradition.
I think Fadi also had something in common with Benedict XVI.
Right.
He would not have reacted to the Regensburg lecture the way so much of the world media and others did. What did Benedict say in Regensburg? He said that Islam, if it's going to develop an Islamic theory of religious tolerance and an Islamic theory of the separation of religious and political authority in a just state, has got to do that from within its own resources. The notion in some quarters, Ayaan Hirsi Ali, for example, a very brave woman, another great writer, but her idea that, the answer to this is to turn 1.2 billion Muslims into good John Rawlsian liberals is just not going to happen.
Right.
And Fuad understood that and therefore appreciated, and we discussed this, how the Catholic experience of developing from inside Catholic theology, a Catholic argument for religious freedom and democracy, might provide a model for Muslims interested in doing the same thing. Now, that took the Catholic Church a couple of hundred years, and it's going to take the Islamic world a couple of hundred years. But you only get to the right destination if you start from the right starting point. And he understood that you had to start from within that tradition and retrieve and renew elements of it that may have been forgotten over time or distorted by the particular cultural milieu in which Islam was born.
Well, so you're dangling before me a jewel that I'm tempted to grab at right now. I want to kind of put that off for a little bit because the topic that you're raising now relates to a discussion I'd like to have about Father Newhouse and Michael Novak and yourself, because there is a criticism, well, I'm telling you that there's a criticism of you that that aims at you're doing that, you're trying, what you would regard as trying to do what you describe with respect to Islam. And there are a lot of people who criticize you for being inauthentically Catholic or selling out to liberalism or all kinds of things like that. Let's talk about Newhouse and Novak in a bit, but I would like to touch on that point with respect to how we should understand what I'll call a dynamic orthodoxy in Catholicism, because it relates to a number of the people that you refer to here, either people who are trying to articulate a particular facet of that, or people who are in fact uncomfortable with certain facets of that. I mean, we could look at Bill Buckley. We can talk about Father Dulles or Cardinal Dulles, Andrew Greely. Those are some folks just right out of the gate on that theme.
Yeah. Let me just be very candid at the beginning, Mark, and say that this notion that Mike Novak and Father Newhouse and I somehow hijacked Catholicism for another agenda is simply mindless. It's nonsense. Would John Paul II have invited us into the company of his friends and conversation partners if we were doing that? Would he have cooperated with me in writing his biography, giving me complete access to him if he thought I was somehow hijacking his thought? I mean, this is mindlessness from people who don't want to engage arguments but are happy, frankly, doing calumny. Dynamic orthodoxy understands, with St. John Henry Newman, that the church's self-understanding develops over time. The church does not do paradigm shifts, as some have argued recently, but the church does develop. A paradigm shift is like what happens when Copernicus knocks Ptolemy out of the box in terms of a vision of the universe, or when Heisenberg knocks Einstein out of the box. That's a paradigm shift.
a fundamental change in how
Fundamental
one
change
thinks or understands something.
exactly. We don't do that. I mean, the faith once given to the saints, as the letter of the Apostle Jude says, remains the faith once given to the saints. But we develop our understanding of that and our understanding of the implications of that. I mean, there is nothing specifically about either the Immaculate Conception of Our Lady or her assumption into heaven in the Bible. But as the decrees announcing or proclaiming those dogmas indicated, this was implicit in the theology of the church, particularly its theology of the incarnation. And we draw out of that treasure house that is Scripture, through the tradition, through the lived experience of the church, things that are new insights. We just talked a moment ago about a Catholic theory of religious freedom. That was something new in the modern history of the church. But in fact, it goes all the way back to Matthew's gospel and the Lord's injunction to give Caesar what Caesar gets, but Caesar doesn't get everything.
Right.
So give God what God gets, which is everything.
All right. Well, as I say, we could spend a lot of time talking about that, but I'd like to go back to some of the figures in the book, and perhaps touching on that theme. I mentioned Bill Buckley a while ago. I'd like you to talk a little bit about Buckley and how you see Buckley.
I think Bill was one of the 5 or 6 most influential Catholic figures in the United States in the 20th century. He was a man of enormous energy, high good spirits, if he will pardon me, a very democratic cast of mind, small d Democrat, wonderful and encouraging young writers in their work, and a man who personally created, more or less, what we now call the Reagan Revolution, this kind of fusion conservatism that really transformed American public life. He did that through his own writing, but especially through the magazine National Review. And he did it in part by getting the crazies out of the conservative movement. Bill drove the John Birchers to the sidelines of American conservatism, crazy conspiracy theorists. He drove the anti-Semites out of the American conservative movement. And that's an important thing to remember for today. Behind all of that was a deep and very sincere Catholicism. He didn't wear it on his sleeve, but Bill Buckley was a Catholic to his chromosomes and lived a life of prayer and piety, and should be remembered for that, as well as all of his other public accomplishments. Okay,
notable Catholic figure, journalist, public political intellectual, founder of National Review, contributor, helped shape, if not father, the Reagan Revolution. Let's move to someone somewhat different. Father Andrew Greely, whom you describe as the loudmouthed Irish priest.
Well, that was actually Andy's description of himself. He said he was nothing but a loudmouthed Irish priest. And he was right. I mean, he was more than that, but he was certainly that as well. We dueled in the Catholic press for years. Our columns often appeared on the same page. He was a scintillating writer. In the early years after Vatican II, I think he did an admirable job of explaining some of the theology of the council to a general audience. What sadly turned Andy Greely in a different direction was his inability to understand the truths that Pope Paul VI taught in Humanae Vitae. He just could not wrap his head around that. And that became the prism through which he read the next really 30 some years of Catholic history.
He's not the only one who had that problem.
No, he wasn't, but he was particularly significant in spreading the ignorance, if you will. And I think that's why he could never really get John Paul II. I mean, if you read his little book on the 1978 conclaves, he recognizes that this is a man, Karol Wojtyła, of extraordinary intellectual and personal gifts. And yet, because Wojtyła was one of the great, not only defenders, but explicators of the truth of Humanae Vitae, Greely really turned against him. And the last time I saw him was during the conclave of 2005, right after John Paul II died, and he had become pretty sour by then. And I think that's a terrible shame. But as I think of him now, he was kind of the last. He was the last batter in the bottom of the ninth inning of raucous urban ethnic Catholicism in the United States. He never got the new evangelization, but he gave, if you will, counter-Reformation Catholicism a boisterous bottom of the ninth inning.
All right. Well, from Andrew Greely to California Dreaming, you have an elegy of Cass Elliot and Denny Doherty. How does that make it into this book?
Well, Cass Elliot, like me, is a Baltimorean by birth, so you have to take care of the home team here. They're in there as illustrations of what we talked about a moment ago, this via negativa. I love the Mamas and the Papas. I think they're one of the great rock and roll groups of all time. Extraordinary vocal blend. It was all a mess of drugs and booze and promiscuity and all the rest of it. But it was great music. And yet all that other stuff, and including that kind of self-absorption, prevented real love from forming. Cass Elliot was deeply in love with Denny Doherty, and he couldn't figure it out. And then, of course, she died of a drug overdose, I believe. He lived for another 30 years and admitted at the end of his life that the biggest mistake he'd ever made in his life was not recognizing and accepting the love of Cass Elliot. So they're a kind of cautionary tale about the 60s and the self-absorption of the 60s. And of course, the larger lesson from a Catholic theological point of view is that genuine love is self-gift, not self-assertion. And I think they embodied that in a sad way.
You quote Mark Stein here on Denny Doherty, and you say, Stein wrote in a fine obituary of Denny, in his final years, widowed, weathered, balding, and paunchy, Denny conceded that turning her down, Cass Elliot, was the great mistake of his life. And that's a powerful thing to say. And I think, you're a little older than I am, but as I'm getting older, I reevaluate how many of the things in our culture are treated and received by younger people. And, it's what a tragedy that he missed this opportunity for real love. And perhaps if he had been properly responsive to that earlier on, Cass Elliot would not have died, and they may have had a wonderful life together. Yeah.
It was a crazy time that produced a lot of interesting music, but a lot of personal devastation. And the intersection of that with bad politics, which brings us to another figure in the book, Pete Seeger. Was also part of the mix here. I'll jump the gun and say that the headline that I put on that obituary of Pete Seeger, he had a hammer and a sickle, I think is the best headline I've ever written in my life. He was a wonderful musician. I love the Hammer song and Where Have All the Flowers Gone and all that stuff. But Pete Seeger was an unrepentant Stalinist, not just a garden variety communist, but an honest to God Stalinist for 30 years. And he only later kind of grudgingly said, well, maybe I didn't read that quite rightly. And that's another lesson from the 60s, and in his case, earlier than that. Ideological besottedness can lead you down some very, very bad paths indeed, even if you're a very talented person, as he manifestly was. So I thought it useful to put him in there as a lesson in how not to do politics.
While we're talking on the subject of politics, tell us a little bit about Pat Moynihan. Now, earlier on when we were setting up the show, I was talking with Christina, who was setting it up, and I was just kind of rattling off some names. There are people that, I remember, and of course, Christina being much younger, they were just names to her. Pat Moynihan was a name. He was a significant figure in American politics 50 years ago. Tell us about him.
Daniel Patrick Moynihan was one of the most brilliant social scientists of the late 20th century. He was a remarkably articulate defender of the democratic project. He served in 4 cabinet or sub-cabinet positions in 4 consecutive presidential administrations of both parties. He was the U.S. Senator from New York for 4 terms. And yet he was a kind of great Catholic what if. Pat would never embrace the pro-life movement the way he should have, because he knew the truth of what we were saying in the pro-life movement. He did not embrace that, although at the end of his life he did vote for the partial birth abortion ban. And he never ran for president. I think in the late 70s, a lot of us thought that Pat Moynihan might be the guy who could bring Catholic social doctrine to bear across the spectrum of American public life from the White House. He never ran, and that was a great lost opportunity. In fact, I think his Senate career, while not without some accomplishments, was almost a coda. I think his real contributions were in his remarkable research on ethnicity in the United States when he was teaching at Harvard, his defense of democracy and human rights when he was the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, his recognition early, for which he got pilloried, of how the collapse of family structure in inner city America was going to lead to great, great trouble down the line. These were the enduring accomplishments of Pat Moynihan, I think, more than his Senate career.
So there's a parallel figure, in some ways parallel, some ways contrast. Henry Hyde. Tell folks who Henry Hyde was. Again, this is somebody who was a prominent figure in American politics 50 years ago. But I think the younger folk don't know, and it's helpful to hear.
Even 20 or 30 years ago.
20 years, yes, right.
Yeah, I mean, Henry was the leader of the pro-life forces in Congress for 30 years, first elected to the House in 1972, a bear of a man physically, great good humor, the best spontaneous debater in the House, absolutely rock solid on the pro-life issues, author, of course, of the Hyde Amendment, which we are fighting to save today against the Biden administration. The Hyde Amendment, which prohibits the use of federal funds for abortion. A gigantic figure in many, many ways, and one of the funniest people I have ever met. Great teller of jokes, great retailer of stories, old-fashioned Chicago politician with a big heart and a very, very well-honed conscience.
So many more figures we could ask about, and I'm resisting the temptation to do that in the interest of time. But I mentioned Father Newhouse and Michael Novak. We have to come back to them. You, along with those gentlemen, formed something of a triumvirate back in the 80s and in the 90s. And I have to say, we alluded to this earlier, it wasn't always well received in the Catholic world, and not just simply in that aspect of the Catholic world that saw itself or described itself as progressive, but even among some folk who were on the more traditional or conservative side of things. Tell us about Father Newhouse and Michael Novak.
I think Michael Novak and Richard Newhouse were deeply converted Christian disciples, passionately committed to the Catholic Church, deeply committed to the authentic interpretation of the Second Vatican Council. Both of them understood that the notion that you could have freeze-framed or freeze-frozen, frame-frozen the Catholic Church in 1958, and that would have made everything just dandy up until now, was really, frankly, ludicrous. There was a lot of contention in the church prior to Vatican II. So the job, in our view, was to put the proper interpretation on Vatican II and to draw out of those 16 documents a vision of what we were calling a moment ago dynamic orthodoxy for the future, which included both an affirmation and a serious critique of the Western democratic project. Nothing that our critics from the right have said about the deficiencies of modern or contemporary American democracy, we didn't say 20 years ago. I'm sorry if these folks weren't paying attention, but they can go to my book, for example, from Ignatius Press, The Fragility of Order, right, and see some of that at work. I mean, the notion that we were unapologetic cheerleaders for everything going on in the United States is just ridiculous. And it would help the Catholic conversation going forward if people would get off the Twitter feeds, actually read other people's material, and then engage it seriously. But this has been the case for a long time, this kind of cartoon view of people. It's a shame, but I'm afraid it's part of the human condition, for which we can thank Adam and Eve, I suppose.
Right. Well, one of the difficulties is people have forgotten how, or if they ever knew, they simply don't exhibit today, the ability to disagree without being disagreeable.
Yep.
And then to properly locate the level of disagreement. It's one thing, you have two Catholics who are equally committed to the Catholic tradition have a disagreement about the interpretation of that tradition with respect to, say, political matters. In our context, there's a tendency for those folks to want to, ramp it up so that it comes across as if what they're arguing about is whether or not to accept the divinity of Jesus Christ or something of that sort. And
well, I have to say, I mean, in my own case, since Michael and Richard are no longer with us, my own attention has been focused far, far more comprehensively on the reform and renewal of the church over the past 20 years than on American public life. I mean, I still keep my hand in that on that front because I think it's an obligation to do so, and particularly under our present circumstances. But most of what I've written over the past 20 years has had to do with the reform and renewal of the church, and that is what, frankly, means the most to me, and where I think my vocational responsibilities primarily lie.
Close us out, George, with a bit of a conversation about your parents. You include them in among the people that you elegize. Give us a little bit of a description of what you say there.
I included my parents in this book, Mark, because they exemplify virtues that I think are important today. Um, Marital fidelity, devotion to children, mature patriotism. My father was a naval officer in the Pacific during the Second World War. Commitment to parish. My parents were both deeply involved in the Cathedral of Mary Our Queen in Baltimore for better part of 40 years. They were not public people. I think they found my life a bit strange, but they were wonderful parents, and it was really an act of filial piety to include the tributes I paid to them at the time of their funerals in this book. And I frankly thought people might like to meet them. They were interesting people and had interesting, if unobtrusive, lives. My mother lived to 95. And as I said in that miniature of her in the book, her lifespan from her birth in 1914 to her death in 2009 was the same as from the first James Monroe administration to the presidency of Woodrow Wilson. I mean, that's a long run. And a lot of stuff happened in that time, and she was a witness to a lot of history.
Yeah, those entries were, they come towards the end of the book, and there are so many great, as you say, public persons who are considered in the book. When I came to them, I mean, obviously you're their son, so that comes into play. But when I came to them, what I liked about it, apart from the personal insight into how you describe your parents, was this is sort of meat and potatoes American Catholicism.
Yeah.
And it was very, very refreshing. It was a great thing, a great note on which to conclude the book. And on that same note, we're going to conclude this interview. George, I really appreciate you writing Not Forgotten, elegies for and reminiscences of a diverse cast of characters, most of them admirable. And I thank you for the opportunity to talk about it here.
Well, Mark, thank you and your colleagues for publishing the book. It's always great to work with you and to talk with you.
God bless.
And to you.